And the corona pandemic threatens about 55 million people who are in need of humanitarian aid in the region, specifically segments like refugees. So some of these numbers are very striking, and I think for me, I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts on how this is going to impact the most vulnerable groups in our region, and I'm sure the audience would like to hear the same. So Stefano, I'd really like to start with you. You've been working with the Ahead of the Curve team on the design of this discussion. Can you briefly tell us why you think this topic is so important to discuss at this particular moment?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Dina. So we basically started from a very simple consideration that this crisis, beyond being a public health and economic crisis, is a livelihood crisis, and a very serious one, especially in countries with high level of poverty. And also being a covariate crisis, a crisis that affects the community at large, even the normal kind of informal safety net system that people rely on by asking support to their family or friends are not going to be working well, just because everybody, especially in poor communities, is going to be affected by the crisis. So every day that passes into this crisis, there are new people who are having more and more challenges to maintain their livelihood, or in some cases even to get food on the table. So, that's where social protection comes into picture. Social protection it can be looked at in different ways, but bottom line is a chief tool to kind of sustain the livelihood of poor and vulnerable people who are chronically poor and vulnerable, especially when they're hit by a shock like this one. So then, and of course, cash transfer is one of the lead intervention that we have in our social protection arsenal. So that's where we're coming from in terms of thinking, and why we thought it was relevant for Egypt to have a discussion that is both international with the perspective that Michael brings, as well as regional and national, of course. And before I close, I just wanted to add a couple of things that as a social protection person and advocate are dear to me, kind of two general consideration. One is about the scale. I was briefly discussing this with Michael where we were about to connect. I mean, normally if a country had to scale up a cash transfer program of several dozens, thousands of households in a few months, that would be considered, I think, by international standard as a good achievement. But in a moment like this, in which there is kind of an element of kind of dramatic urgency, I think in order for social protection intervention to have an impact, there's a need to kind of prioritizing fast scaling up of these interventions so that people can receive support early enough and avoid, for instance, resorting to negative coping strategies like selling their productive asset, vital assets, or even other coping strategies that we know and that soon are going to become for many people the only option left. And the second consideration I wanted to make, and then I'll stop, it's going to be brief, and is related to the first one, is about targeting. I mean, in social protection, there is an endless debate about those who think that it's crucial to set up complex targeting mechanism against, of course, I'm simplifying, but against those who say that the priority should be sending out cash to entire categories of people in need. And in a moment like this, I would think that kind of this dispute might be put to rest, and that the priority perhaps should go to reaching out people as fast as possible. So I don't want to add any other elements, but I hope that some of this, there'll be a chance to discuss them in this discussion today. I'll stop here. We have a group of very distinguished guests. I just want to thank Ahead of the Curve for having me part of the small group of people who organized this, and I'll be listening. Today. Thank you very much.
Stefano. Michael, I wanted to move to you, taking it a little bit to the global perspective. Can you tell us more about the triple threat that you see that is being posed from COVID?
Sure. As we look at this experience around the world, we see analysts looking at this as a triple threat. The first threat is, as we just heard, it's a health shock. Obviously, that's what defines it. But as Stefano pointed out, very importantly and very controversially, the indirect consequences in terms of livelihoods, in terms of economic impact, in terms of social impact is really important as a second set of interacting shocks affecting the crisis. But what really defines this is the third threat. It's a policy shock. Never before in my lifetime have I seen a crisis where it's the policy response itself that so accelerates and intensifies the immediate economic and social consequences. So it's these three threats: the health shock, the indirect economic and livelihoods shocks, but very importantly, the policy shock. And the implication here is how we respond to this crisis has the most important impact on how people experience it in the short to medium term. And how we craft that policy response will determine the medium and long-term costs. And not just domestically, a big part of that policy response is transmitted internationally by what other governments are doing. So it is truly a global crisis.
Just a quick follow-up question. Do you think that we're in a moment where we can start thinking a little bit differently about public-private partnerships, the role of the private sector, the role of bottom-up innovation to tackle some of these really difficult challenges that we're going to face from COVID-19?
At every level, certainly, in terms of the health shock, vitally importantly, and how we deal with the economic consequences. Certainly, the private sector is the main respondent to the economic shock. How they deal with this, by shutting down, by keeping employees employed, by furloughing, is vitally important. But then also, when we look at the medium to long-term consequences, how we deal at a very micro level with livelihoods support, keeping people connected will be vital. That's going to require very significant private sector participation at both the large corporate level and at the micro household level.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michael. Khalid, I want to move to you, but before I do that, I just want to ask the audience to please, as we move along, type in your questions in the Q&A box, and we will be taking a selection of those questions posed towards the end of the discussion. So Khalid, from your position at ESCWA, specifically with regards to the Arab region, I listed a number of shocking numbers, which I took from you, I think, statistics. And what are your thoughts about what's going to happen in the Arab region? How is COVID going to impact our most vulnerable groups? And specifically because in the Middle East, when we think about vulnerable groups, we always think about the poorest of the poor, the refugees. We have very clear, I think, segments of vulnerable groups that are already very well known in our region, but what additional vulnerable groups are going to be added as a result of the crisis?
Thanks, Dina. First of all, thank you for asking me to join this, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a good question. What we knew, and the problem with this crisis is that it's continuously changing. So it's a pretty fluid situation when it comes to the flow of information. So, for example, some of the numbers that you quoted in your introduction were based on information we had a month ago, which now seem to be quite redundant. That 40 million projection, if you look at the latest IMF figures for the region, would now quadruple almost to 150 or 160 billion, which basically means that our assumption, our sort of base case assumption of declining GDP of 1 to 1.5% for 2020 and possibly 2021 now suddenly becomes almost 3 times as much. That's the problem that we're dealing with here. And of course, the same applies to the employment figures as well. But I'm interested in looking at the potential ramifications for the poor and the vulnerable. And the problem we have in the region is that it's really there and validated in a lot of the literature, is that the regional impact for the Arab countries of any additional shock to income is much higher than what you would expect for any other developing regions. Why? Because a lot of the people, all of the population is situated right above the poverty line. So if you were to have a shock of 1% to income, you would have a far more higher proportional impact on poverty. What does that mean? If we are estimating, for example, that 8.3 million additional poor in March would result as, if based on the initial assumptions, now we're probably looking at maybe 20 million or so. I don't know. I mean, we still have, as I said, we still need to continuously update this, but it's going to be significant. And also the impact on the middle class and the vulnerable is also going to be equally significant. The important thing is not to reach a number, Dina. The important thing is to explain that the order of magnitude is really going to be high. And that's, you know, just try to bring the attention of decision makers that this is going to be an issue. We need to take it into account. The business as usual, you know, responses on social protection may not cut for this kind of situation. So that's basically, you know, my quick response to your question. Over.
I was on mute. I want to move now to Nahla and Ghada to take us to Egypt, which is a very big country in the Middle East with a huge population. So Nahla, what can you tell us about what's happening in Egypt now? And what are your thoughts with regards to response in specific regard to social protection?
Okay, thank you, Dina, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel.
As we got too much discussion on Takaful and Karama, so we can throw that at Ghada.
Okay, I will leave Takaful and Karama for Ghada to talk more about. So basically, in Egypt, the shock, of course, is like everywhere else. It's a health shock, but also a livelihood shock. Egypt also is one of the fifth largest country that receives remittances. So the impact also of remittances loss is highly expected, also because oil prices are going down, and this can impact the expatriates working in the Gulf. They might return because of the shrinking in the Gulf market. And of course, the tourism is impacted, and the prices of natural gas have also been impacted because of also the oil prices. So a lot of things are adding to the impacts on the poor and the vulnerable. Like Khalid mentioned, in Egypt, the people living below the poverty line are 32%, but we know that there's another 20 or 25% that are right above this poverty line. So these people with all these shocks are very easily can fall below the poverty line. So in terms of response, the World Bank in general, and I think this is aligned also with the UN perspective, is basically saying build on existing systems. So like the Takaful and Karama should be built upon, because there's preparedness when it comes to databases and administrative data and the capacity of the government to expand. And this expansion can be either vertical or horizontal. You can increase benefit size, but you can also expand coverage. And this can happen very quickly because you have a database of some rejected, people, and you can just take those who are close to the PNT line. But also on pensions and social insurance, this is another area where the World Bank, Egypt has already increased pensions for the next fiscal year by 14%. But some other countries are taking measure to either postpone contributions or reduce contribution or subsidize contributions. But these are countries that have the fiscal space to do something like that. The third response around social protection is, of course, the labor market and things like when the COVID restrictions are a little bit, the confinements is slowed down, programs like public works and cash for work can come back again as a medium-term measure, because also we're thinking what should happen in the immediate term, but also what are we expecting because this is there to stay. So we have to think also, and we know that we're getting into a recession. So what other programs other than cash transfers or social insurance can we do? And of course, active labor market programs and public works, cash for work, which Egypt has actually implemented, is another area that we are actually proposing to the government as a response measure. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you, Nahla. That was really great for me to hear. I want to switch to Ghada. I'm a big fan of Takaful Karama, and I've been wanting actually to send you a message and ask you this question from the start of the coronavirus. And for those who are not from Egypt, Takaful Karama is the main social protection program in Egypt right now, and that was designed under when Dr. Ghada Waly was a minister. I'm wondering, Ghada, if you can share with everybody how you designed Takaful Karama, but specifically your thoughts on how the program design is what is going to allow Egypt to respond to the crisis right now. Because you were very, I think, in my opinion, very out of the box and innovative and entrepreneurial in the design of the program. And you, from the get-go, integrated technology, you integrated partnerships with the private sector, and you created a massive database that can allow the government to identify who needs social protection. And I'm wondering if you think the way it was designed will now allow the government to quickly integrate those who are very vulnerable, who actually we may have never even thought would ever be in that vulnerable group.
Okay, thank you.
Is that a big question?
Thank you for inviting me to speak about a topic that is very dear to my heart, describing what we have done in Takaful and Karama and how this can help. How did we design it? The question, I had three questions in mind. What do I need to do? Who should I do it with, and how to do it? What do I need to do? I needed to protect and promote. Protect the vulnerable and promote and invest in the future. Who should I partner with, and who is my target group? My target group is the most vulnerable, and those who are vulnerable and could become vulnerable and in a risky situation. So you could be vulnerable because of age, and you're not going to get younger, but you could be vulnerable temporarily because you're out of a job, or you could be vulnerable because of a disability, or you are vulnerable because you are in a geographical area where there is very little investment. So identifying the target group and who should we work with was another element in the design. And the third element was how should we do that? And we wanted to do that in an efficient and effective way. Efficient in terms of costs and in terms of outreach, and in terms of transparency. And it was very important to have a flexible design that allows people to come in and come out, and a flexible design that allows adds on, so you can add pieces to the program. So to me, social protection is not about cash transfers. Social protection is about a safety net that protects and promotes and invests in the future, and that is there for those who need it when they need it for the time they need it. So an infrastructure, building an infrastructure was very important, training more than 20,000 providers of services to be at the front line, being in 5,000 villages and satellite villages, so the presence in the field so that people know that they have a place to go to, and data, collecting data. The data collection and the information we collected did not just allow us to target the people who are in need, but also allows us to design other programs and to intervene at times of need. So if you want to design a program for instance, investment in public works or in infrastructure, a cash for work program, you can use the database for Takaful and Karama, because in this database, you know about the health of the population and the health conditions and the diseases that they suffer from. You also know about the education level of every member in the household. You know about the situation of the household in terms of infrastructure. So whether they're connected to water, to sanitation, whether they have access to public services or not, all this is in this very rich database. Also, consumption patterns are captured in the database because we capture the consumption of mobile phones, the consumption of electricity, the consumption of water, whether they go to public schools or private schools, and how much do they spend on tutoring and everything. So the data was very important. To have a very, very big data set, we did not yet use all the data that is there. You can do plenty of analysis. It's just a very big data that is very, very rich and can allow you to reach the people. Using people from the villages themselves, using outreach workers, officers who work in the village, there is this social capital. People know each other, and then announcing who are the beneficiaries to everyone so that people can help us with the exclusion and inclusion errors. This system of a safety net needed to be there for us to be able to identify if they are in need of cash transfer, if we want to give them food and ration cards and increase the amount of food on ration cards, if they need some health interventions and health support, if they need some disability benefits, and so on. So we went slowly by building a very big database, and it was based on one element, which is the ID, the national ID. This identification number was very important because it allowed us to link to other databases in the country, more than 11 databases in 11 line ministries and institutions. We also partnered with NGOs, and it was very important to partner with NGOs because they are working with vulnerable groups, and we benefited from their experience and their databases. And of course, we also partnered in the private sector in outsourcing to the private sector the innovative and technology and delivery related part. So to me, Takaful and Karama is a good base, and it allows us not just to look at those who were targeted and seen as people who are eligible, but also those who are rejected because they're close to the poverty line are in the database, and the reason of rejection is there. So if they were rejected because they have a small or micro enterprise, we know that they are in the group that will that may benefit from support to SMEs, and this is also an element of social protection. So you need to help people with their health, with their education, with their jobs, with availing cash and liquidity, not just cash.
Great, thank you, Ghada. And Tafeeda, I really want to move to you because Palestine is a very, very unique case for a variety of different issues. What is happening with regards to the pandemic in Palestine, and what kind of responses are we seeing to the crisis for the Palestinian population at the moment? And what are organizations like Taawon, but also the private sector like the Bank of Palestine doing in this space at the current moment? Oh, Tafeeda, I have to take you off mute, sorry.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you very much, Dina, for inviting me. And yes, as you said, Palestine has a unique case, being the only place on the earth that is still under occupation. The population is around 5 million people. 40% of those reside in Gaza. I must build on what Ghada said, because the Ministry of Social Development has a system already, and it helped a lot in following up on the vulnerable. We have around 280,000 families that are vulnerable. That's before the COVID. After that, like a week, by last week, the number of families increased by 100. However, because of the poor economic situation and very limited budget that the ministry has, only 115,000 families are benefiting from the social protection packages. With the 100 new ones now, we have also the 100,000 families are now benefiting as well. And the benefits are include the cash assistance in addition to offering health services and education services, free education in the general education, school education level, with 30% exemption from fees at the higher education level, and so on. The new category with the new families added are eligible for both only for the period of the emergency. So there is really an ambiguity about what's going to happen with these newly added ones, but the system that they are following is really a well-developed system. It's very flexible and helps in, it has the data already, and that's why the response was very quick in terms of identification of the new vulnerability. And we're talking about, almost doubling in terms of those who are benefiting only. So the Ministry of Social Development is the main provider for social protection. It was before and it's still going on. Right after COVID, of course, the private sector was the main provider for help. Basically, the Bank of Palestine is the biggest national bank in Palestine, and its contribution to a fund that was created for the purpose was the highest. The fund is called Waqfat Izz. Waqfat Izz is Solidarity for Dignity fund. It was called for by the president and the government prime minister. And the call was for the private sector to chip in for that with a target of $30 million until the Eid, which is by the end of this month. So far, the amount of commitment is only $15 million, with much less that is still in hand. That's for the private sector part. For the non-governmental organization, Taawon is only the leading that sector in terms of funding. It launched an appeal in the amount of $5 million. Until now, they managed to get 4.4 million in commitment and half of those in hand. And actually, the half have already been distributed to the vulnerable in the form of food packages, helping the young farmers, giving them subsidies so that they grow their crops, and then they purchase, the Taawon purchases the crops and distributes it to the poor and vulnerable. In addition, health kits and sanitary, kits, and also these protection like masks and so on were distributed to the disabled and to the elderly, especially in the homes of elderly and so on. That's about this section. Another thing that is really emerging is the SMEs, the small, medium enterprises. We are getting a lot of help from the Arab funds like Arab Development Fund and Islamic Development Fund. Basically, this is being channeled through the private sector. Mainly, the Bank of Palestine has managed to attract $30 million recently, and in the air, I think in a month's time, the bank will be able to attract another $30 million. PIF, which is the Palestine Investment Fund, also declared the availability of $25 million for the purpose, where it will target the vulnerable in a form of giving them loans with very, low profit on that. I must say that the situation in Palestine is really very bad in terms of the vulnerability. We noticed already we have figures that says that a good number of those who are in the middle layer are now falling into the poverty level and also into the vulnerability group. The unemployment is now at 29, poverty level is now at 29.2%. Before COVID, it was 27%. The unemployment in Gaza is around 65%, which is really, really very high. So all of these indicators are, shows that Palestine is really is suffering. And basically the reasons is because of the occupation, where Gaza has been under siege for 12 years. Jerusalem has been recently also since last year, annexed to Israel with the mobility is almost, it's very strict mobility between the Jerusalemites and Ramallah and these places. In addition, we have the deal of the century, where over the past year, donations for Palestine from USA and other European and even some Arab countries have ceased to be delivered in a trial to put pressure on the government to succumb to that. So that's pretty much what's going on. We hope that we will collapse as a system.
We know that Palestine is in a very tough place. We all hope that, well, I guess the whole region will be able to overcome. And very quickly before we have lots of great questions coming in, but Nahla, when we first started thinking about this, doing this session and talking about social protection in the Arab region, whenever I would mention to somebody that we're doing this webinar, and I would say, Saudi Arabia is also a country that is going to be facing some very difficult times as a result of the crisis, people get a little bit surprised. Can you wrap up and talk a little bit about what is happening in Saudi Arabia, and are we going to see an increase in the need for social protection measures as a result of the crisis? And I'll ask you to be very, very brief so we can start taking questions.
Yes, sure, absolutely. Saudi Arabia is looking into expanding its cash assistance. They already have a solid program that is quite generous. They're looking into expanding this program right now, but also Saudi Arabia is taking other measures, like they're doing a very big intervention related to wage subsidy for 3 months for the firms. So they're covering 100% of workers for firms with 5 Saudis or less at the rate of 60% of their wages, and they're covering 70% of workers for firms with more than 5 Saudis at the rate of 60% of wages. And this is big. These are very big amounts. It's around 10.6 billion Saudi riyals. They've excluded some sectors like telecom, supermarkets, and groceries are not part of this subsidy, but it is a huge subsidy. There is now some discussion about how about giving subsidies also to expatriates. There is a discussion. This is not happening right now, but the discussion is there. We are having this discussion with our Saudi counterparts, and they are looking into such a measure. Also, the Saudi government has recently looked at changing some of the articles in the labor law, putting a worker on exceptional leave, allowing including paid leave, giving entitlements while you're on leave. This wasn't the case in the law, and reducing workers' wage in proportion to the number of actual hours worked. So they are introducing some measures around these lines. And just since I have the floor, Dina, all countries, including Egypt and Saudi, are looking into digital payments because of the whole issue of social distancing. How are we going to get the cash to the people through e-wallets? And the whole issue of digital payments is being very much on the table because you want to promote social distancing. And it's actually with every crisis, there's an opportunity. So the opportunity with COVID, it's really the financial inclusion opportunity and the innovation with digitalizing payments is huge. So I see this as a positive outcome of this crisis.
What a beautiful way to end, Nahla. I think it's too bad we don't have Mohammed Al-Kesha from Fouad, who just started a new fintech fund called Disrupt Tech, that I think was started at the exact right moment to be able to address a lot of the issues and related to movement of cash over the upcoming period. Okay, so I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. There are lots of really great questions. I'm going to ask all of you and your responses to be extremely, extremely brief, as in 30 to 60 second answers. The first question I have is, what weaknesses has this pandemic revealed in the overall setup of social protection programs in MENA? Any takers? Maybe I'll reframe that. What opportunities has this pandemic revealed? Just to build on Nahla's last comment, what opportunities has this pandemic revealed in terms of the setup of social protection programs? So I think, Nahla, you mentioned one, which is how can we integrate fintech into social protection?
I can say words about that. In some countries in Southern Africa, rapid registration processes have put in place to reach informal sector workers in days. Historically, it's taken years to roll out a new program, and this crisis is impelling governments to do whatever it takes and to respond immediately, and technology has played a vital role in doing that.
Dina, if I may add, no, I see there was a challenge because thank God we had Takaful and Karama, the database that Ghada Waly spoke about. But for irregular workers, Egypt, 63% of the economy is informal, and we did not have a database with registered informal workers. So I think the lack of such a database, they've opened now a portal where people can go and apply. But with COVID, also it shows you when you have 63% of the economy informal, how are you going to reach the people? So this is a very big challenge, not just in Egypt, by the way, this is in India. The issue of informality in general is a big issue for many countries and not just Egypt, and COVID has really exposed that.
Indeed, if I may add to that, Nahla and Dina, it's also kind of forcing us to think out of the box in terms of revenue generation options and the questions about the larger macroeconomic policies. Clearly, for example, some basic figures like what can you do, what new measures in terms of new tax revenue streams that can come in. One thing we're contemplating in ESCWA now is actually a solidarity wealth tax. According to our latest research paper, which will come out in a week or two, the top decile of the region as a whole has estimated around 5.7 or $6 trillion in wealth. The top 10% of that owns 4.3 trillion. The top decile in the region also has about 2/3 of the income streams. Now, I'm just mentioning these figures because it just shows you that then, okay, so the next question is, do our current fiscal policies, are they progressive enough? Are we targeting, for example, property taxes like other developing countries at the same wealth or income level as our region do? And our preliminary assessment is that there's a lot more room for this to happen. So, for example, a 1% annual tax, property or some form of appropriate wealth tax, and clearly this has to be studied depending on each country context, can be enough to close the poverty gap for middle-income countries. I'm speaking specifically of countries like Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, middle-income countries. So that's another opportunity, I think, is presenting itself as a result of the current situation.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes, very briefly. I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Okay, I just want to mention that there is a good opportunity for social impact type of funding and projects, and also for small and maybe micro, businesses. And I think there is a belief now that it's important to fund that area. This is the area that makes the economy wheel starts going or ticking, which is really very much needed in this crisis. And I see that it will be focused upon after that.
I also hope that there will be a rise in social impact investing, Tafeeda. So there's so many great questions. I won't be able to take them all, but there are a lot of questions that are being posed about unemployment and jobs. Specifically, how will the COVID crisis impact small and medium enterprises? And I would agree with this question. For the past decade, everyone in the region has been focused on bottom-up economic development by supporting SMEs and new business growth to respond to the job challenge. The Middle East has the largest cohort of unemployed youth in the world almost right now. So what are your thoughts on how we will protect those who will become newly unemployed, who were recently employed by this growing sector of entrepreneurship and SME growth? Ghada, I see you ready to go.
No, I mean, it all depends on how the situation unfolds. We have three scenarios that we're looking at. If this is going to be a 3 months, a 3 months lockdown, March, April, and May, you have very specific sectors that are severely impacted, like tourism, for instance, hospitality, travel, and everything related to tourism and travel. Some sectors are going to be hit for a very long period, and their recovery will be very challenging, but other sectors are less hit, and other sectors will be able to recover faster. And I think that countries now with less travel will be looking inwards and trying to find opportunities, and as you have been saying at the beginning, the silver lining. Because we haven't been, for instance, able to import many of the inputs to many of the industries and the factories, they're looking within the country for producers, for small producers, for ways that will develop the value chain. So you will see the value chain develop in a more positive manner. Also, you will see a lot of innovation that is related to the challenges posed by COVID, like working from home, like producing from home, like finding ways to connect and provide services in an innovative way. When the population is very young, like the population of this region, then expect a lot of innovation. And this is an asset. They are younger, they are more eager to get out of the crisis, and they are risk takers because they are younger. So you will see a lot of innovation, not just by the private sector, but even governments will have to find new ways of doing business and will open up to new ways and to really new partnerships, be it with NGOs or with the private sector. We have seen in Egypt a lot of work done by NGOs and a lot of initiatives by youth to support and to promote and to create opportunities. So I'm not very pessimistic. And I always believe that this is going to be something that we will learn a lot from, but it's not going to stay with us for long, and we are going to get out of it stronger and better than before. And of course, governments and countries have learned the importance of having the infrastructure of a social protection system, the importance of investing in health, the importance of investing in education and in remote education. So you will see a lot of innovation in sectors, like I
said. There's a complete virtualization of many sectors, right? So much is moving towards the digital space now. And we will see a reshaping of a lot of sectors, including education, including healthcare, as a result of what we've seen over the past 2 months. So I guess my question is, I'm hopeful. I don't know if I'm ever going to be the optimist that you are. You're the eternal optimist. I am definitely hopeful. But did we as a region, are we really prepared for what will happen with this virtualization? Maybe Khalid, you might have something to say.
You're never prepared, Dina. No country is prepared. Why are you talking about this region? Was Europe prepared? Was the US prepared? You can never be prepared.
No, absolutely not.
Yes, so you're never prepared. But when you are in trouble, then comes the innovation.
No, I agree. I think what Ghada said, it makes a lot of sense. There is reason to be optimistic, because if you looked at, and I have a lot of other numbers, if you really want to get depressed, I can tell you, for example, that in 2012 to 2019, the Arab region was the lowest worldwide in terms of labor productivity growth. And there was a lot of, I mean, we know that we have structural transformation problems. We know that oil and the reliance on the rentier, and there's a ton of literature out there. But this is a wake-up call, and that's the silver lining. You cannot continue. Business as usual will not work. So that's the good news. The question is what to do next. How do you make this transformation? What are the entry points for making countries realize the importance of utilizing human capital? The biggest tragedy, I think, in Arab development has been that when you look at, for example, basic indicators on human development, secondary education, primary education, infant mortality, we've been doing great. And our latest report with the ERF has shown that not only have we been doing great in reducing the deprivations, but also inequalities between rich and poor. But when you move into quality issues, when you move into how you're able to capitalize on this human capital, this is where you have a problem. Your problem is in the economies. The economies and the way that you've been managing the economies hasn't been able to utilize on your human capital. That's why you have the lowest rate of returns on human capital. But now I think this is the way for us to rethink the development model in a way that you can increase that value added. And a lot of the discussion that we've been having on how to do that, and a lot of the discussion on the impact of the fourth industrial revolution and disappearing jobs and other jobs being created will determine how we go forth. But there has to be that determination to rethink the development model. And I think this situation we're in will definitely pave way for that.
Agreed. Thank you, Khalid. All right, some quick questions from Nashwa Salah to Dr. Ghada Waly. Is the Takaful and Karama database also accessible to microfinance institutions? And is the data linked somehow to their iScore records? I guess Nahla or Ghada can take this. Nahla, you want to take it? You're both on mute. Ghada, you're on mute.
What's the second part of the question on iScore?
Is the Takaful and Karama database accessible to microfinance institutions, and is the data linked somehow to iScore records, assuming that in order to give out loans?
iScore has records of people who are already borrowing from the microfinance institutions. So if you are borrowing from an NGO, a microfinance institution, a bank that provides microfinance, you are on iScore. We are not linking the iScore database to the Takaful and Karama database, but I don't see a reason why not, if there is a need to look at the database that we have. An MFI can come and coordinate and find out who gets what, but this has to be, there's some privacy of information, so you have to get the approval of the people to share their information with microfinance institutions. But no, we are not linked to iScore.
Okay, perfect. All right, and I have to choose. I'm going to have to only take one more questions. Some countries are exploring universal basic income. Might this be a consideration for the Arab world?
Well, it depends on the fiscal space. it's a matter of resources. And it depends also, and maybe Khalid can add to this, but this idea is a very noble idea of a social protection floor and a minimum income for all, but it depends on the number of the size of the population, the resources that the government has, and how are you going to really identify the amount of money and create the fiscal space for it at a time where the government resources are suffering, because you have less taxes collected, you have less resources coming from all kind of resources that you have in the region.
Let's see. Karen Fanous, who's actually a former Ahead of the Curve employee, saying, thank you so much for the inspiring panel. I wanted to ask, how do you evaluate the potential of graduation programs in Egypt as a medium-term social protection measure? Given the database infrastructure of Takaful and Karama, the World Bank's efforts towards active labor market programs, and the possibility of having large proportion of those just above the poverty line falling into the need for protection, is there potential for combining protection, prevention, and promotion, maybe in a graduation program? I think, Nahla, this is for you.
Yes, I think we're already signed a new loan with the government on that. So we have a component on graduation under the existing Takaful and Karama project signed with the government. And the program is called Forsa, and it's about combining consumption support, cash transfer, it's cash plus. So you're combining the cash with some graduation interventions, whether through asset transfer or through training for job placement. So this is already, we have a pilot in 8 governorates that's being rolled out. And definitely with or without COVID, graduation programs are very important, and very much you will find in many countries that their cash transfer programs over time will have a graduation component, because you want these people to be dependent on themselves, especially if they are able to work. The idea that you are giving them cash is because there's no opportunities for work or livelihood. But when the opportunities arise, these people can work, and probably through work, they will get better pay, because the cash transfers are very small. And we know that the people are not living on them. They're just there to help a little bit with the consumption and with better diet and better food. And we know that these people will need to do other types of livelihood activities to sustain the family.
But Nahla, quick follow-up also. Do you think, this from another participant, do you think that, and this is, I guess, for all panelists too, that we will expand our social protection systems to include unemployment benefits as with countries like the United States?
I think what the government has done for now, when they opened the database for irregular workers, these irregular workers are electricians, plumbers, usually they have an income. The reason that they are giving them 3 months compensatory one-time off transfers for 3 months is a type of a temporary or time-limited employment benefit until they are able to go back to work.
Tafeeda, in Palestine, are we seeing any?
In countries where Dina, I just want to tell you something. Unemployment benefits are much easier to implement when you have the largest part of the economy is in the formal sector, because you know who's working and who's not working, and it's very easy to apply for unemployment. But in countries where most of the economy is in the informal sector, those unemployment benefits are very difficult.
Yeah. Tafeeda?
Yeah, in Palestine, I don't think this is possible at all. We don't have that in the system to start with, and we don't have the money, and we cannot even, as a government, cannot cover the vulnerability. As I started, when I said we have 280,000 families, only 115 is covered. So I don't think it will extend to cover the unemployment as well.
Right. Okay, last question from a participant, and then I'll ask my final question, and then I'll let all of you go, because I know it's approaching close to iftar in the Arab region. Samar Saeed, who's a PhD student at Georgetown University, I'm reinterpreting her question which is basically, do any of you anticipate relationships between the Middle East and the West with regards to aid and policies changing as a result of the COVID? In other words, will the Arab region work its way to becoming more self-sufficient and less dependent on Western aid moving forward as a result of the crisis?
If I may take a shot at that.
Absolutely.
I think all developing regions and are going to have to adapt to a global environment where there's less money for official development assistance. That's the natural, logical conclusion from looking at the situation. But that also forces us to think as a region for other solutions. And that's why our ESCWA policy brief has proposed an emergency response fund for the poorest countries, and specifically for helping countries like Yemen, like Sudan, other countries, even Syria. There are significant proportions of the population that are going to be food insecure. Remember, this region imports 64% of its cereals, $110 billion on average a year. And most of us are living in countries that are not self-sufficient in terms of food production. So it's going to have a major impact. So I expect that we're going to have to become more dependent on the regional resources and then the global ones. Can I just add one thing to what Ghada said? The serious problem now is exactly that. I mean, how do you adapt with the limited fiscal policy options that you have and the need for these additional resources? We're going to, again, have to think out of the box. If, for example, we can't reach the informal sector workers for using traditional methods like unemployment benefit schemes, then we think about unemployment guaranteed schemes. We think, for example, about, again, like I mentioned, the wealth inequality tax. We're going to have to, middle-income countries may have some room to borrow by increasing some of the debt thresholds, like what's happening in some countries. So each country will have to think out of the box to make it through out of this crisis. Over to you.
Michael, you
Dina.
Sorry, Nahla, can I let Michael go first?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, actually, I had my hand up to respond to an earlier question, but I think we also have to be very concerned about an impending inequality shock. The increasing importance of virtualization and the use of digital technologies may leave the most deprived behind because they're not connected in ways they can benefit. So our responses really need to take a very specific equity focus.
Or it may lead to more inclusivity because many might not have a smartphone, but everyone has a phone. And a lot of these new technologies are allowing for SMS to give them access. Nahla, please go ahead quickly.
No, I just wanted to say from the World Bank side and IMF side, there is money, of course, because this is the time where we know there's no fiscal space because the revenues are going down and the governments need to do a health response and a social protection response. So the bank has a COVID facility that has 160 billion, and many countries are coming to the bank to borrow, at least for a limited period of time, because they are unable to manage it. Egypt was actually recovering and was on its way to actually put a pause a little bit on borrowing. But this has made Egypt come back, and they will need to borrow at least for IMF from 1 year. The bank has done other measures with other IDA countries where the bank has done debt relief, because we know that these countries will not be able to pay their debts. So for IDA and least developed countries, there are measures of debt relief for these countries, but also governments must be mindful of how to prioritize their fiscal sustainability by doing maybe credit guarantees instead of grants, tax deferrals instead of exemptions. So we are promoting certain measures for a temporary period, but in a way that preserves that the government will get kickback revenues after some time.
Yeah, thank you, Nahla. I think we are pretty much out of time. So my final question to all the panelists, and I'm certainly not the eternal optimist that Waly is, although I aspire to be. I am definitely a big supporter of hope. So my final question to each of you is, considering the circumstances and the many opportunities that have now become apparent to us of how we can transform our systems to the better, what are you most hopeful about moving forward with regards to developing systems that will really serve all of our citizens in the region from a social protection aspect? I can just quickly call on each of you because I can see boxes. So I'm going to start with Tafeeda, and I'll ask you to be very brief so we can wrap up. You're the first on my screen on the right.
I think we have to develop systems, and before that we have to set laws and to ensure that there are systems to follow in these in our region, this COVID just opened our eyes on the issue of vulnerability, and from the point of view that it is a human capital that needs to be given a chance to contribute and to stand on its feet, and not only a system for protection but for prevention is very important, which is a system that is not present in many of our countries.
Thank you, Tafeeda. Khalid?
No, I mean, I'm optimistic. I'm worried, of course, I'm concerned, but I am optimistic that now the conversation.
Hope and not optimism, by the way. You can choose hope.
Yeah, I'm optimistically hopeful in a way, and cautiously optimistic again on some issues. I mean, this is a region where the prospects were determined mainly by oil prices. Now everybody agrees oil prices are going to go down. It's going to have an impact, and now with the COVID, now we're seeing that impact really that we thought was going to happen maybe in 10 years time. It's happening right now for many countries. So things that were completely inconceivable, are now beginning to appear as not just plausible, but really the only feasible options. Not just the wealth tax, things like, for example, having more discussions at the societal level about how to get out of this, and it will open the door for more participatory, more transparency, and hopefully getting things done differently, and especially on fiscal policies. But that will not have an impact unless it transforms on the real side of the economy, unless you see that the productive youth coming back into the labor force and being utilized. That's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you, Khalid. Nahla?
Thank you, Dina. I think one area that we did not talk about, and I want to close my talk with, is women. I think COVID has also shown the impact on women has been, it's different. The COVID has impacted women and men in a different way. 70% of health workers all around the world are actually women, and they are at the front line. And we have seen also the extreme burdens of unpaid care work, whether because the children are staying at home because they can't go to school, and or you have people elderly or people falling ill, and it's always on the shoulders of the women that they also have the burdens of this home care. And we've seen that the gender-based violence and interpartner violence has increased a lot during the COVID time all around the world. So I think better systems of grievance management and complaints management, especially for women. Many of the cash transfer programs all around the world have very strong GRM systems, which is grievance and redress systems. And Takaful and Karama has that. But I think on the side of women, there is more need to have better systems for complaints management and psychosocial support for women. This also was an area that was exposed as weak, not just in Egypt, but in many countries, that women really need a lot more support when it comes to the healthcare sector, but also when it comes to violence and violence against women.
You are optimistic that our governments in the region are going to start focusing a lot more on issues related to women, but more in terms of inclusion and equity and protection than ever before?
I think so, because already the National Council for Women has developed, it was one of the first actually governments that developed a women NCW response note done by the government. And there's a high degree of national ownership where they analyze all the shortcomings and what type of action plan is needed. And I think this is the right start to assess the gaps and to put forth what type of interventions you need to do going forward.
Well, I hope that we start working on this at a more regional level, and that we see Egypt working closely with Jordan and Lebanon and the GCC countries and Palestine. I think for me, I'm more optimistic about more regional integration when it comes to social protection. Michael?
I'm an optimist. I see room for optimism in 3 areas. The world will become more global. 3 months ago, we were looking at China and saying, China has a problem, and we're paying the price for that now. We'll begin to see a problem anywhere as a problem everywhere. I think we'll also see more equity. If we do not mainstream equity considerations into our response, we're going to see an inequality shock. But we see governments paying attention to this, particularly in extending digital reach to the poorest households. And third, we're changing social norms. Social norms, crises are one of the most powerful ways to tackle troublesome social norms. Gender equality, child protection, even getting governments to work together in a more integrated and comprehensive way. I think there's a lot of room for hope here.
Thank you, Michael. And Ghada, our eternal optimist, please give us the finale.
The systemic changes or the systems, you will see governments investing more in preventive healthcare and in primary healthcare. And governments all over the world will be paying more attention to preventive care. They will be investing more in virtual learning and remote learning and infrastructure for the internet. They will be paying more attention to the work that civil society is doing and learning from it and partnering with it. I think that the fact that so many weaknesses have been exposed in the social protection systems will force governments all over the world to, scrutinize and look into their own social protection systems and try and have something in place, especially because what we have learned is that there will be other waves of corona, so it may visit us again the following years and the following seasons. So this is going to be a seasonal pandemic and it's going to come and visit again. Then societies and governments will be readier next time with better systems, and will work on putting better systems in place. And I think even for politicians all over the world, they will be paying more attention to the needs of the vulnerable and the poor and the masses, and really trying to protect and promote, as I have said. Just to add on what Nahla said on women, of course, COVID has impacted women in a very negative way and in a much worse way than it has impacted men, but it has impacted society as a whole. So families have become closer, people have become closer, communities have become closer. I think one of the positive outputs will be more resilience. Communities will learn how to be resilient. And that's not bad.
I think the hope is that as a result of all of this, all countries will become more resilient and pay a lot more attention to those who are most vulnerable. So I wanted to thank you all for being a part of this very, very important discussion. And to the people who came to attend, the participants, thank you for joining us. Next week's session will be focusing on the future of education. I hope that many of you will join us again. And thank you guys all for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. I know you have to run for your iftar, so Ramadan Kareem. And Michael, hello from another part of Massachusetts, but I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.